Hello and welcome to episode 17 of Taking Liberties. My name is Lee. Unfortunately, we had a bit of a technical problem in the first few minutes of this episode, and basically we're coming in at the 6-minute mark or so, with Vickers talking about, the whole episode is talking about sort of agrarian socialism within the Liberal Party, and particularly with the mine that has been announced in New South Wales and Barnaby Joyce's particular opposition to it. So unfortunately that's what happened with the setup, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode.
That is actually a huge part of the Australian culture. Ever since like 1901, the very first Act of Parliament we passed was like White Australia policy, and that was because we didn't want the price of labour to come down, and fuck the Chinese. Because of the hordes at the Pilbara, whatever. Irrespective, we've never shaken off this culture of like just appreciating the nanny state, and I don't think enough fighting is done at a ideological level to really force the major parties to shift on this one. And I think this is an utter failure, particularly of Liberal students, because Liberal students are amongst the biggest, they constantly chant freedom, but when they start taking up positions in power, they become as douchebaggy as the ones they were talking about. Every last one of them.
Yeah, that's just the nature of politics, though. That's the effect that politics has on, and
I don't mind that as a reason, but
it's more that once they get elected to Parliament, the most important thing of once you're in politics is staying in politics, and if anything threatens of me losing my seat, then I'm going to put my seat. Put my electoral success first.
So I know there are some Liberal students that listen to this thing, so this is my message to them. The ALSF can only be considered an abject failure until the culture of nanny statism in Parliament ceases to be a thing. Like
ALSF, you mean like the Australian
Liberal Students Foundation? Because this is their big thing. Federation, sorry. This is their big thing. And I said, you can only count your organisation as an abject failure until this one thing changes.
Yeah.
And no matter how many people you get elected, right, your organisation has failed until this one thing changes, because you are exhibiting essentially what we talk about as regulatory capture, but in terms of ideological capture.
But that's a problem, because that attitude exists within this, within the broader community. So it's not something unique to politicians. Yeah. It's they follow the trend. Like they follow what's already going on. So if everybody was libertarian, all our politicians would be libertarian, whether they're actually truly in their heart of hearts libertarians or not.
So I actually don't agree with that, and we've segued from the topic in a fantastic way, because this is talking about the nature of politics in Australia. Yeah. So in 2001, right before 2001, we had this like massive trend where we wanted to be like on the world stage as like the leader of Asia, like this Western power in Asia, the big influence nation and all of that. And after 9/11 happened, basically you had John Howard standing there and going, "We're protecting this country. We will protect our borders," right? And that sort of spun off into a whole bunch of nebulous other stuff, like stopping the boats. All of this other stuff dealing with national security spun off.
But I think...
And there was a massive shift in there.
Vickers, that it's worth pointing out that the way you've characterised how government there is not entirely correct. I mean, they did have a separate China policy than the US.
That is true. Yeah. Actually, the better example is the other thing that I liked about the Howard government was the culture of deficits. They changed it. They changed the economic discussion in this country to say that government debt matters, right? They said, government shouldn't have a lot of debt, right? Before Howard came in, right, and you'll constantly hear people talk about this, is Howard delivered 10 budget surpluses, right? Sorry, 8 budget surpluses. They eliminated government debt, right? And now that's why the budget emergency line took on so much during the Abbott era. So there was another case of politicians leading. So politicians need to...
No, I don't think so.
Part of ebb and flow. It's part of the ebb and flow here. They need to be able to lead. They need to be able to follow.
Yeah, I mean, nativist sentiments, that is, we need to, which is essentially the sentiment that's behind all this farming stuff. It's the same on issues of immigration. It's all, we need to protect our own kind of stuff. I mean, that's as old as time itself. Like,
Yeah.
you could read any political tract from any period in history and you'd find those sorts of sentiments. And, you know, like so it's nothing new and it's ever present. But it's so in that regards, it's just tapping into something that's always been there. In fact, the whole notion that you could have a multicultural, open, tolerant, liberal order that's the revolution. Like it's that's going against the trend. So I mean, Howard. I mean, even if you look at the immediate circumstances of Howard and all this immigration stuff, I mean, Pauline Hanson was pretty successful in 1998. Like. And you can really.
That's another example of a politician shifting direction.
Yeah,
she forced everybody to the right.
Yeah, so it's. I mean, I don't think it's the case. I think politicians always follow. At least they can't. I mean, successful politicians, that is. Leaders of parties and stuff won't buck the trend, and that's, I guess, where it matters whether Barnaby Joyce is an agricultural socialist, because
there's always been a underbelly in Australia of protectionism and xenophobia, which I think overall the major parties have kept down most of the time, although a lot of the time, thanks to a lot of the media, it rears its head every now and then.
I mean, it's probably something like it's a large minority that's probably got those sort of sentiments. Like I think broadly speaking, my experience of Australians is they're broadly open-minded towards all forms of international contact, all forms of immigration, all of that sort of stuff. It's just there's always a noisy, largest minority that there's unwilling on various issues, and there might be different people on different issues are particularly xenophobic. And in the case of this mine, it is clearly xenophobic. I mean, if it was Americans building this mine, actually, you know what? I take that back. If it was Americans, you probably have the same rhetoric because Australians have this thing against Americans. But if it was an Australian built mine, you probably wouldn't have the same sorts of issues. But the fact that it's Chinese and the yellow peril.
The people who will say we're not attacking the free market, they'll always say, but it's a state-run enterprise, so it's not a pure free market. That's always
in which case, why would you complain about a foreign government subsidizing Australian jobs? I don't understand.
Yeah.
Well, it makes even less. It makes even less sense. But see, I actually disagree with something that you said there before. You said. Or was it that people, if it was an Australian mine, they wouldn't complain as much? So some people might not, some people won't.
Yeah.
But the Greens will.
The Greens will, because they're anti-development. I mean,
So kudos to the Greens. They aren't xenophobic on this one.
Yeah, it's true. It's a good point.
They just hate development.
So it's, I guess, what you'd call Blair's law. That is, multiple strands of idiocy combining together in a larger idiocy, which is you've got xenophobic farmers and NIMBY Greens coming together into this.
Well, we basically have in mining and coal seam gas in particular this unholy alliance of Alan Jones and his supporters and the Greens.
Yep.
And to where if you listen to his radio show on a regular basis, he's pretty much best friends with all the Greenies now.
So I can't help but feel that a large part of this should be blamed on Barnaby Joyce.
Yes.
So he should not be giving as much air to this kind of ideology as he should. But he is an agrarian socialist, and to his credit, he's being consistent on that. He represents agrarian socialists, and he does that quite spectacularly. And I sit there and facepalm all of the time.
Yeah. And I mean...
I know you hate him, but yeah.
Yeah. It's... Well, I mean, as a country liberal, I'm part of the Liberal Party, and down my way, we have plenty of, not even in the National Party, because there's essentially no National Party down in the southwest. There's only the Liberals. I'd say all the ag socialists are with us, and it's something we have to deal with all the time, and it's insidious. Like it's one of those things where they don't come out and sort of clearly state we are protectionists, we are socialists. They kind of they come up with all this other. It's like all this GM labeling law stuff as well. I mean, this is kind of in this case, it's like those wine labeling laws and all these labeling laws. all it is we want to do protectionism, but we don't want to call it protectionism because we don't like that word. So let's have these other things that target this, do the same thing, but don't use the same language.
So another example of that is actually quarantine laws. So everybody, so I'm going to assume everybody in this conversation, but feel free to correct me, is okay with the idea of quarantining Australia against various diseases for fruit and flora and fauna that we don't have.
Yeah.
Fine idea, right? I too like the fact that we haven't had particular diseases here.
Yeah.
It's great. However, there is a weird amalgamation where quarantine law is then used to basically enforce protectionism.
Huh.
And the best example for that was apple blight.
Yep.
Right, recently. So, so New Zealand ended up going all the way to the World Trade Organization, right, and suing Australia, and successfully won, right, by pointing out that we had engaged in protectionism against New Zealand apples, right? Because firstly, we couldn't prove that they had blight, and secondly, we were importing from a country that did have blight, America, right? So it was a pretty easy case to prove.
Yeah.
Right. So, like I said, so as an Indian, for me, this case, for me, I face this on bananas. So people might not know, but there's actually more than Cavendish and plantain types of bananas. There's about 600 different varieties. Most of them come from India.
Right.
Yeah. However, in Australia, because of our quarantine laws, and just we don't actually grow any of these other bananas, but better be safe than sorry, precautionary principle sort of stuff. They prevent the import of all these other types of bananas, and it's really more protectionism than anything else. There are other countries with quarantine laws that allow them in, so New Zealand is one of them.
Yeah, I mean, and I've seen these sorts of motions like targeting these sorts of issues of importation of other fruits and whatnot in the sort of my division, where they've people saying we shouldn't import grapes from here and there, and I think part of the issue is that we have undermined property rights. Like, this is really you could do things better rather than just blanket banning things. If you actually regulate it in such a way as that you tied the importation of these particular whatever it is to basically make somebody accountable. That is, if they bring in something they shouldn't, they get sued. I mean, right now it's much like with a lot of regulatory things, it offloads the responsibility on the government. And if the government gets it wrong, well, there's no one who gets held responsible. Where if you move to sort of more of a property rights focus, it's individual importers have a responsibility to make sure they're not bringing in diseases and whatnot.
Yeah, but for individuals, like say if I brought something from, India.
Yeah.
Right. How the hell would someone actually be able to prove that it was I brought in and say not some of the ones that Fred brought in that caused the entire infection? So,
well, I mean, the likelihood of one person bringing in something that's going to completely catastrophically destroy all forms of agriculture everywhere in the mainland continent of Australia is probably quite unlikely. So, I mean, having a separate regulatory framework for individuals is so you could say we're not going to let individuals bring in something in their suitcases because we can't track that. But we could have a system where everything that comes in that's biological is tracked and traced, rather than banning it. You then have chains of responsibility where you could say, well, this importer brought in this batch of X, therefore we're going to sue the crap out of you because you're the one who screwed up.
It would be pretty easy. It's pretty easy to design a system as you described, but as we've all talked about, the xenophobic fear creeps into all of these designs, and so as you pointed out before, we're not making decisions based on fact and research, but just on our emotions.
Yep, correct. And I don't think it's ever going to be avoidable. So I know we talk about regulatory. I know I mentioned regulatory capture before, but Australia doesn't actually have as much of a problem with regulatory capture as it does with, I'm going to coin another term here, the creeping share ear. And it's basically... what? So it's the only way I can sort of describe it. It's like this massive sort of groupthink element that just sort of devotes so much time to government. Right? We just want government to take care of everything. And
well, in Australia, there is I've always find it frustrating that the culture is there always ought to be a law. If there's a problem, there ought to be a law. I think the worst example of this I saw in recent years was when Channel 9 started having Tom Waterhouse in their NRL coverage. Like, everyone hated that so much that Channel 9...
I couldn't actually understand the problem with that. I remember what you're talking
children,
about.
Vickers. You got to think of the children. Why aren't you thinking of the children?
That.
You got to think of the children, Vickers.
Everyone
the
hated
children.
it, and Channel 9 got so many complaints that they voluntarily said, okay, we crossed a line, so we're not going to do it anymore. And so the market was able to self-regulate. But then Julia Gillard and Stephen Conroy said, right, we're going to come along, we're going to pass a law to ban this. Look how good we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that too.
Since we're talking about this, is actually a pretty good segue into some other stuff to do with ag socialism, which is just the vast infrastructure there is given to helping farmers who clearly are unable to help themselves. So, with the agricultural white paper, we've got all sorts of handouts for farmers. We've got the ACCC getting involved. We've got all sorts of tax incentives and whatnot. And I guess I always find it funny that farmers are supposed to be these independent, self-reliant people, and yet, there's $250 million given in cheap, government loans to farmers, and...
the reason why agriculture always gets these sort of sweet deals is because Australia, they've always idolised the farmer.
Yeah.
And so governments have always tried to capitalise on that.
So, because were you going to say something, or is he there? I think he might have dropped out. Or he's just the same look in his face is fixed. So I'm guessing that's some sort of yeah. I mean, it's. I mean, and what's funny, if you look at the US in particular with their farm bill, is that they too idolize the local farmer. The middle-aged guy standing there, holding a shovel, while he's digging the thing, and blah blah blah. But in reality, in the US, most farming is done by these huge corporations, and so all these handouts are going to corporations. And I'd be interested to know if Australia's the same, where there's a large corporate
I guess it's probably the same. Actually, one thing that I've so Australian farming is, so we say our farmers are the most efficient in the world, and the standard that we use, and I got into a huge technical fight about this with someone who worked in agriculture. It was a friend of David Linehelm's, and I can't remember his name now. But basically, the measure that we use is the dollar output.
Oh, Vickers is dropping out.
The crop. This is the dollar input. Sorry, am I dropping out again?
Yes. Yeah, a little bit.
Sorry. Like I said, so the measure they use is the dollar output of the crop versus the dollar input, and they use a ratio for that. And they basically calculate, who has the highest ratios, and they figure out, how, if that's a measure of efficiency. Now, I have an objection to this because, the way to manipulate that, obviously, is to price set on one side high, or better yet, reduce the amount of costs as much as possible, which is what we do. We subsidize a lot of what the farmers do, which is how we get that side really small, right? Which means now that ratio is going to be really big. The one that's actually important, in my opinion, to measure the efficiency of farms is how many millions of bushels of actual crop you're growing per square kilometer. And when you look at that, Australia is amongst the worst in the world. We use a lot of land to grow very little, right? And that factors into a lot of things like water costs, transportation costs, all of this other stuff that really should be lower. And we're not setting right incentives to move that lower.
Yeah.
If I go back to, what was it, year 10 geography,
in part, it's because the
is that Australia doesn't have very good farmland, which is why we probably have the inefficiencies you talk about.
And I mean, to be honest, most of Australia isn't usable for anything else but farming and mining. So, it's not exactly a terrible thing that Australian farmers maybe aren't the most efficient in the world. But I guess what's not going to make them more competitive and more efficient is these handouts. We're talking I mean, it's interesting. Barnaby Joyce, quite a while back, was on Triple J on their hack program, and this is around I think when they sort of had a bit of a drought in the east, and they had a big. I think it was when the Abbott government first came in, and they had this big, $225 million in all these loans being given to farmers, and the host said, "Well, why don't we just treat it the same as any other business?" And that's the whole thing. And Barnaby Joyce had no answer, because essentially the whole premise is that somehow farming is different. Like, it's not subject to supply and demand. It's not subject to prices and incentives. It's somehow this magical land where we need magic to help deal with all these magical problems. And instead of saying, well, you need to prepare for the future. Like, if you talk about like a mining project, it's a 30-year project. They're spending $1 billion or $10 billion or whatever many billions of dollars.
It's always this. Bob Catter always used the lines that we have to be able to feed ourselves. Yeah. Yet, for any other product, we don't say, for example, that we have to have our own phones. Like, we need enough.
Well, we need to be able to communicate with each other. I mean, communications is the whole thing. We need to subsidize phones, or you need to be like. I mean, we kind of did subsidize the car industry, but like,
they do make the arguments like that.
Well, it exposes the stupidity of the "we need to feed ourselves" argument.
Yeah.
Yes. I think, though, we're strawmanning their argument. Their argument is everybody eats, right? And we don't want to be in debt to any other country for food, which I always found silly.
Well, I've thought of another one. We all need clothes.
Yeah.
So, yet all our clothes come from China. So how come we don't need clothes security?
Yeah.
Yeah, but they do say about food security. It's just like, oh, look, if any of these countries went to war with Australia, we'd be done in a couple of days. And my general sentiment to that is, well, look, it's a lot harder to go to war with a country that you have trade deals with.
Yeah.
Particularly if they're democracies, right?
Yep.
And there's very few democracies in our part of the world. But we trade largely with democracies.
And sorry, go. I was going to say.
Yeah. Sorry, and I was going to say, it's very hard to do this because now you've got all these business people, all these people reliant on jobs and everything, that all of a sudden need to hate you as a country, right? And instead of their economic incentive to deal with you, and then sort of agree with their government to go to war with you. It's a lot harder to sell. It's a lot harder to do.
Yeah, and really, before the lead up to World War II, what you saw is nationalists like Barnaby Joyce and all these idiots who jump up and down about Chinese mines. They undermine trade, and we saw the breakdown of international trade all the way up to World War II. And I think that's, it's sure. I mean, I'm no historian, but it's hard to not say it didn't play a part in stirring up hostilities between all the various powers because. As Bastiat said, if goods don't cross borders, guns do, soldiers do. So it's really the case that this nationalistic sentiment is actually it undermines the sorts of things that produce freedom and peace and all this sort of stuff.
Yep. No, I completely agree.
So well, I guess that probably does it. I mean, we've got 30 seconds to go, but yes.
No. Give everybody an early break.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I don't have anything.
I mean, the bottom line is we just need to, I guess every week we say, promote free markets, promote individual liberty, because that's what works.
And especially for this week, think rationally. Yeah. Don't be consumed by fear.
In the words of the great philosopher Flavor Flav, don't believe the hype. And on those profound words, that will call it the end of this episode of Taking Liberties. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back again next week.
Bye.
Bye.